This is a story that many people skip. Not because it's unimportant, but because it's deeply, profoundly disturbing. It is a narrative found in the book of Judges, chapter 19, a passage that confronts us with the darkest corners of the human heart. It tells of a night that exposed something dark and hidden about a nation that had completely lost its way. A night that mirrors the ancient horror of Sodom, but this time the evil was internal. It was growing within the very heart of the promised land. So we have to ask the question, why is this in the Bible? Why does this darkness need to be remembered and preserved for generations to see? What can it tell us about ourselves when we are pushed to our absolute limits? This happened during a time when Israel had no king, no central leadership, no consistent direction. The period of the Judges was one of tribal fragmentation, spiritual decline, and a slow erosion of the values that once defined them. The moral compass of the nation was spinning wildly. The text repeatedly tells us that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, ignoring the ancient standards they once held dear in favor of their own immediate desires and perspective. And that, as history shows us time and again, is exactly where the greatest problems begin. When a society loses its foundation, the structure itself begins to crumble from the inside out, often in ways that are as subtle as they are devastating. A Levite was traveling from Bethlehem, returning to the remote hill country of Ephraim with his concubine. They were tired, looking for a place to rest, for a moment of safety before the night fell completely and the dangers of the road became too great. They stopped in Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. At first, no one welcomed them. No doors opened in hospitality. No one offered them bread or water. They were strangers in their own land, surrounded by their own people. Until one man, an outsider himself from the hill country of Ephraim, opened his home. He recognized their need and offered them the protection and hospitality that the rest of the city had forgotten, inviting them into the safety of his hearth. But as they were enjoying their meal and sharing stories, the city revealed its true face. The shadows began to move in the streets. A low, menacing murmur of voices gathered outside the walls of the old man's house, growing louder by the minute. A group of worthless men surrounded the house, banging on the door and demanding control. They weren't looking for a guest. They were looking for a victim. They demanded access to the Levite, their intentions clear and dark. The host tried to plead for peace, for the ancient and sacred laws of hospitality to be honored, but his words fell on deaf ears. The situation spiraled into a nightmare of compromise and desperation, where every choice led further into the darkness. What followed was not just an act of violence, but the total and devastating collapse of human dignity. It was a failure of the city, the tribe, and the very heart of the nation that had turned its back on its own foundational truths. The night turned long. It turned dark. And it became a chilling mirror of the horror that had once fallen upon Sodom. But this time, there were no angels to intervene. Only silence and the cold, indifferent stars above. When morning finally came, the silence was heavier than the darkness had ever been. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth to the events of the night. The reality of the horror was now visible for all to see, a stark stain on the day. She was at the door, motionless, fallen across the threshold in a final act of desperation or exhaustion. The weight of what had occurred could no longer be ignored, and the silence of the city was now a scream for justice that reached the heavens. The Levite's response was as shocking as the crime itself. He took a drastic symbolic action meant to send a shockwave through the entire nation. A message that was designed to ensure that the events of Gibeah could not be buried or silenced. He sent a piece of the story to every tribe, forcing every person in Israel to pay attention, to look at the rot that had taken hold in the heart of Gibeah. to decide who they were going to be and what they stood for. The nation was forced to confront its own darkness. Silence was no longer an option. They had reached a point of no return, where they had to choose between immediate judgment and total moral collapse. The stakes could not have been higher. This is why this story exists in the sacred text. Not to glorify the darkness, but to expose it for what it truly is. It serves as a stark, uncompromising warning of the consequences of moral abandonment and the loss of truth. It shows what happens when a society loses its moral foundation, when the objective standard of truth is replaced by personal preference and individual whim, when right becomes whatever we want it to be in the moment. This story purposefully mirrors the account of Sodom in Genesis. The parallels are undeniable and intentional, but there is a terrifying difference that the biblical author wants us to feel deeply in our bones. In Sodom, the evil was from outsiders, a foreign threat. But in Gibeah, it was from within. It was Israel, the people who were called to be a light to the nations, who had become the very darkness they were meant to oppose. They were supposed to be different. They were supposed to carry the standard of God's holiness and justice. Their failure was a profound betrayal of their very identity and their ultimate purpose in the world. The story of Judges 19 asks us a haunting question that echoes through time. What happens when a people lose their standard and replace it with their own desires? When truth is sacrificed on the altar of convenience? When there is no objective standard, everything breaks. The individual, the family, the community, and eventually the entire nation. It is the inevitable and tragic result of total moral autonomy and the rejection of truth. This is not just ancient history. It is a warning for every generation, including our own. When truth is abandoned, chaos is the only thing that remains. We ignore this story and its lessons at our own great peril. When there is no standard, everything breaks. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more untold truths.